Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our COVID help resource. We're here today to talk about post-COVID consumer trends. My name is Sarah DeVasher Wisdom, and I'm the President and CEO of Greater Louisville, Inc. Along with all that we have experienced these past few months, we're also looking at a very different economic future that also includes the way people will be spending their money and how consumer trends align with that. We're very lucky to have a top national advertising and PR firm literally in our backyard. We shared a building until I think it was March when the Doe-Anderson moved out of our building. Doe-Anderson represents well-recognized companies and brands like Maker's Mark and Maui Jim, and has 100 years of tried and true research and results. We are excited to have Amy McNatt, a senior VP at Doe-Anderson, who leads the strategic brand and communications planning practices. Amy is going to discuss the 7 trends they've identified on how behaviors, attitudes, and expectations of consumers may be permanently affected by the global pandemic, and what businesses and brands can do to adjust. Before I turn things over, I want to give you an outline for today's presentation. After our presentation, we'll be taking questions from you. Iris Wilbur, our VP of Government Affairs, will be moderating questions. So please use the chat feature on Zoom to ask your question, and we will be sorting through those questions and asking them at the end of the presentation. We're also recording this webinar, and you can check back for the recording on www.greaterlouisville.com. With that, I'd like to welcome Amy. Amy?
Hi, thank you. I'm just going to flip the screen here. So I know that we got a little bit of an introduction from Sarah. I just want to sort of make sure to introduce Doe-Anderson fully. We have been around in the Louisville area since 1915. Which actually makes us the 3rd oldest independent agency in the country. It's something we're really proud of. We currently have about 125 employees working for approximately 31 clients. And we have, within the last 5 years, actually opened a satellite office in Columbus. So we are, Louisville based, but we do have this other office to service some of those clients. We did just recently, as Sarah mentioned, move actually out of our Main Street building into a 4th and Broadway office in the Kindred building. We're super excited to actually be able to get back into that office fully once all of this is kind of behind us. Now, I am really proud to represent a broad team of strategists and analysts. Doe is exceptionally well staffed in this area. We have everybody from a doctor of data analytics to, to directors of connections planning that help us think about how to really reach consumers in the media space in new and creative ways. So, we get together as a team weekly, if not more often. And even through sort of the COVID, lockdown, we were still getting together and we were asking our group questions about sort of what was going on, with marketing, what were we seeing happening with consumers, and what guidance could we give our clients. And we ultimately ended up publishing a piece that was really designed to help our clients navigate how to market in the days of COVID quarantine. But as we were working on this, while we were thinking about the present situation, we couldn't help but think about how this will ultimately affect the future. Really, all of these cultural experiences that are so broadly shared, they have lasting effects. Think about how people coming out of the Great Depression, shop and store food because that is the scenario in which they were raised. So we asked ourselves sort of what will the imprint of this global cultural experience be on people moving forward, and how can we get in front of that so that we're building plans and marketing communications that ultimately address and appeal to some of these newfound values, attitudes, and behaviors. Now, we didn't just, talk to ourselves in a vacuum. We have a really healthy suite of tools that we used to make sure that these were incredibly informed. So we do a ton of real-time social listening, but going beyond that, we have several resources that we tap into that tell us how consumers are acting, lots of polling going on. So we just really sort of plugged in, followed a little bit of our hunch, and then really let the data tell us what was happening. And ultimately, what we came back with were what we are calling 7 key consumer trends coming out of post-COVID. These are things that we predict are going to be sort of the marks of this experience on consumerism from now moving forward. And we'll go through each of these pretty quickly, but just as a reminder, there is a full report available on our website if for some reason you want to get a little more detail. So the first one that we'll talk about is what we call the return to expertise. Now, anytime you talk about something returning, you kind of have to ask yourself, well, where did it go? And so we go way, way back on this one. Expertise is actually like a core piece of civilization as we know it. Basically, as soon as humans figured out farming, we could shift away from everyone having to be a hunter-gatherer, real sort of just survival. And people were able to start to specialize. And those specialized services provided focus, they provided training, and what you saw was expertise ultimately emerge. Then over hundreds of thousands of years, we actually developed institutions and leadership structures that reinforced and strengthened certain areas of expertise and frankly created intellectual authority within our civilizations. And this is really important, right? Because you do want somebody that knows what they're talking about when you need surgery, when you need legal advice. These aren't for the faint of heart. This isn't sort of a casual experience. Expertise is incredibly important to healthy society. But something happened. First, our institutions started to sort of crumble around us, and people took a step back and said, oh my gosh, I put a lot of faith in this system that I was told was the expert, and it didn't work. At the same time this is happening, the internet is sort of this mass tool of empowerment, right? Information is suddenly widely available. You can find anything you need to know. And so we're all sort of our own advocates. We're all experts suddenly because of the internet. And as this is going on, all of these sources are available to us, but discerning real from fake becomes a real challenge for people. And suddenly sort of everyone's a liar, and you don't really know who to trust except for the people who are like you. And this is actually well documented sort of drop in what we consider all of the big trust metrics. So the Edelman Trust Barometer is one of the most respected global studies that we use, and it really does look at how people are trusting or distrusting different types of institutions. And by 2017, really 2016, government and media, as 2 of our major institutions worldwide, had fallen into a state of distrust, meaning more people distrusted those institutions than trusted them. And Edelman actually wrote in 2017 that globally, mass population had actually fully rejected any sense of intellectual authority. We were just done with it. We had sort of been failed. We were burned. We were taking matters into our own hands. And then 2020 comes along, and suddenly everyone's leaning way, way in to people who seem to have a handle on the information. Experts were suddenly important. They were back in the spotlight. People clung to these daily press briefings. It wasn't just the doctors, right? It was the governor. It was the president. These were critical points of information. People understood that there was sort of a single source where you could get the latest information, and people really wanted to know what was going on. That same global trust barometer, they did a pulse check in April and found that public trust in government had increased 11 percentage points versus the year before. This was huge. The drop had been gradual, and now the spike was growing. Trust in government it doubled in 6 of 11 markets that they surveyed. And all of a sudden, more people trusted it than distrusted it. One of my favorite things that came out of this whole experience was sort of the cultural rallying around these briefings. One of my friends got me these, we all have beer with Bashir t-shirts, which I think is just a fantastic sort of capture of this cultural moment. And it really says, we were all tuning in. 5 o'clock became a thing. And you needed to know, you needed to be watching because it was the way to get sort of the latest information. This was not something you were going to, check back in on later. You made it a point to be there at 5 o'clock. But there was other stuff happening at the same time. This isn't just about, did people tune in to the governor? Did people care what the doctors were saying? Major news institutions across the country were providing free access to coronavirus related information. And what you saw was that news websites went up while gossip websites went down at the same rate. So people were really turning to sources of credible information. Doctors were being positioned in a way that they could answer community questions. So you stopped turning to Facebook to ask people if your symptoms might be worrisome, and you started turning into, where can I find access to a doctor today? That is a very, very, very significant difference. And what we sort of see happening here is that this is just a trend that's rising. So this chart shows you social media conversation specifically about people saying you should trust, you should believe, you should listen to the experts. And you can see that the volume of those mentions of that conversation has basically doubled in a month from February to March versus, the entire 6 months prior. So people are sort of suddenly reframing what they think about expertise. So if you're a business, what do you need to do? How do you respond to this? How do you prepare? The first thing is understand if you provide expertise in anything. It doesn't have to be health related. It doesn't have to be coronavirus specific, but know that the post-COVID consumer has a strong affinity now towards expertise. And how do we provide it in a way that helps win them over? So show your experts, make sure your audience can see it, make sure they can believe it. If it's about putting your scientists, your chemists, your engineers, those experts front and center, that's a tactic you can take. If you don't have scientists, engineers, and chemists in your in your employee roster, then think about how you can appeal with the expertise of others. If you get the stamp of approval from someone, accreditations, accolades, respected awards, those can help build belief in your brand. So those are the types of tools that you want to leverage to tap into this trend around the renaissance of expertise. The second trend that we identified was one that we're calling from me to we. This one is really interesting because it sort of turns what you could say is sort of an American ideal of individualism on its head. And it's a complete shift from this idea of like, my health and wellness is totally up to me, to a very real understanding that community health is a community problem. And as a member of the community, that is important to me as well. It actually does affect me. Something that was really interesting to watch early on was that there was a little bit of a tension here in the way people were behaving, right? There's some selfishness in hoarding toilet paper. I do not want to run out. I don't care if this is going to leave somebody else, I'm going to get all that I can in this one shopping trip. And at the same time, people were delivering all of these messages of strength and community. And we watched this tension kind of for a little while, wondering kind of where would this net out? But the truth is that being part of society, being a member of the community is incredibly sort of fundamental to our human psyche. It's not something, again, that we can just abandon. It's really built into the programming of the human brain. And so we saw that this idea of community first behavior was actually on the rise. A lot of people talking about helping neighbors, a lot of people talking about how they could do their part, and the conversation around helping others really grew pretty quickly. I think we tracked about a 50% average increase in the volume of that conversation. And it's not just something that consumers are sort of doing among themselves. They're watching corporations take similar efforts to unite to help solve community problems. And the more companies that do this, the greater the expectation is for other companies to follow suit. So it only takes one or two to sort of start, and then expectations evolve. Couple of great examples were a collective of some digital media platforms that actually opened up a hackathon to people. So sort of open sourcing, giving people a platform to help solve the community's problem using the tools that they had on offer. Of course, this is pretty well documented at this point, but Ford, GE, and 3M kind of teaming up to help make protective equipment for healthcare workers. All of these things continued with other examples. And it wasn't just about citizens uniting, it was about citizens watching corporations unite, again, as part of this collective community. So if you're a business, what do you do? A couple of things that you can think about is connecting to sort of combat the issue, help the community problem. One is, can you be a facilitator? Can you help people connect through your own service or your own products or your own facilities to kind of bring people together so that they can help sort of reinforce a community solution to a community problem? Can you be a mobilizer? Or are there other ecosystems that you're a part of that you could actually tap into? And how do you think about those relationships going beyond the virus and the pandemic, thinking that this trend will ultimately continue to sway consumers' loyalties? The third trend that we looked at, we're calling accelerated digitization. And it's honestly not something that's totally new, but it is something that we saw just explode in the face of the pandemic and people sort of living in this stay-at-home situation. Now, the digital age actually, started in the 70s, and none of these tools that people are using today are necessarily new, but some of them are a little slow to catch on. So you have to think about the fact that humans by nature are hardwired to sort of look for the lowest hanging fruit, right? We ultimately are programmed to avoid exerting a lot of effort in what we do. It's, again, human truth, fundamental to our biologies. Our brains will actually trick us into thinking, for example, that the fruit at the bottom of a tree is riper. We're convinced of that, and you cannot break this. It's just hardwired into your bodies. And when we think something's going to be challenging, we tend to kind of avoid it. So even if we say, I know that if I do this online grocery ordering, it will make my grocery shopping experience easier. Figuring out how to get into the program, how to order the things, where you pull up to, all of that stuff actually becomes a pretty good mental block for a lot of people. Learning new stuff, it can just be hard, and that barrier can be enough to keep you away. But of course, now we're all stuck at home and we need the things that we need, or we want the things that we want. So people have embraced these digital solutions at an insanely rapid pace, even for tech adoption. I think I read today that streaming services for, Hulu, Netflix, Disney Plus were up 43% in May. So that's not March when this started. That's not April, the second month. This is the third full month of quarantine, and there's still a 43% increase in streaming services. And the most interesting part of this is that the demographic gap in terms of age has really started to close. If anyone else has been on a painful Zoom call with one of their elderly parents or grandparents, you're experiencing this in real time, right? We've all had to make adjustments, including people who may have been turned away previously from digital services. Food delivery services are one of the most compelling examples. We saw that In March of 2020, the conversation, the volume of people using these services and talking about using them took a complete shift from the younger demographic to the older. And I apologize, this chart has a little bug in it. It looks like it's slightly out of order, but that 65 plus group actually is the highest, strongest change there in terms of not using it, not talking about it, to using it and talking about it. We watched Uber Eats as an example get over 250% increase in engagement on social media in just 1 month. So these services are really here to stay. The point being, once you get that hurdle crossed of like, I don't want to figure out how to do it, you're not going to go back, right? We all understand now how to do it. We're going to keep doing it. So what do? We say you ride the wave, right? If you have something that you can experiment with, if you have a digital solution or you have something that you can offer, recognize that people are ready to give it a try. People are a little less afraid to try new digital things, especially if your audience, your core consumer has been older and you've thought, that's not really the platform to reach them. Think about how you might start to change some of those and consider digital as a value-added opportunity. Maybe there's something you can enhance your experience with, if not offer something totally new. So really look at what those digital tools might be. If you can't build it yourself, consider finding a partner to be able to sort of do some of the heavy lifting on the tech side. The fourth trend that we are going to talk about today, we are calling ambient wellness. Again, this is another one that was sort of bubbling there under the surface. We've actually been talking about it a while. We have several healthcare clients. Wellness over sort of just going to the doctor when you're sick or only thinking about your health when you're ill has been a big shift in consumer mindset for a while now. The thing that really happened now is that people kind of went from a little more relaxed idea of hygiene and wellness and keeping yourself from being sick to everyone's a germaphobe. And there was this huge about face on that, right? Like there's a little bit of like, well, you can sort of just incorporate wellness into your life and, you eat okay and you do a little exercise and you'll be fine. And now it's, oh no, actually you have to do hand sanitizer 18 times a day. And if your hands aren't raw from washing them, you just haven't done it well enough. And that is a very important mental shift for this moment. But it's not going to last. So this is one where we think people's desire for hygiene will stay, but their willingness to do it so sort of mindfully and with so much effort is probably going to trickle away. So what do we need to do? We need to make it effortless. You're going to see effortless monitoring continue to take off. This is going to be more than heart rate and steps tracking. It's going to be temperature checks. It's going to be other indicators of an illness emerging that people are going to want to have sort of plugged in and monitoring full time. There's effortless sanitizing options that are out there. This little thing in the middle picture here is actually from a Chinese-based automotive company that has developed this thing called a wellness pod. And it basically sanitizes a vehicle's interior air through ultraviolet light. Now imagine if every Uber in town had to have one of these installed. Wouldn't you feel a little better getting into that car versus one that didn't? It can become a point of differentiation. Finally, we look at effortless well-being. There are tons of products out there right now that claim to help you, restore your muscles or restore your mood simply by wearing them. These are all products and services that we think are going to be highly valued in the future. So what to do? We say be health positive. So really thinking expansively about where, when, and how customers or consumers are going to interact with your brand or your space, kind of putting yourself in their shoes and thinking, is there something I can offer here that's a health boosting measure? So this isn't about prevention. We're going to talk about that next. This is about boosting health, making people feel better, being health positive. And are there things you can do from an innovation standpoint that align really well with your brand positioning that help really boost this sort of sense of well-being? As I just mentioned, the next thing we're talking about is actually twisting to that prevention angle. So a little bit more on the protection side. We're calling this trend preparedness is the new Prada. And the language there is intentional. It's that, yes, we need to be prepared. It's not just, a Boy Scout mantra anymore. But it is going to be, in a sense, sort of a style choice for a lot of services and a lot of businesses. So again, we like to think about sort of what's the underlying human truth that's driving this behavior or this attitude. From a evolution standpoint, we really aren't that evolved. Showing off, again, is one of those hardwired sort of biological requirements. Humans in this way are not much different than a bird of paradise. We are built to attract a mate. We are built to show our counterparts that we're successful, that we're smart, that that we can survive. But all of those signs of success have really evolved over time. So it's no longer, in the hunter-gatherer days, it was who was strong and who looked like they would survive the winter. Now it's who has really great taste, who's going to the best restaurants, who's sort of intellectually enlightened. That's the kind of stuff that we use today to show that we're a successful person, to show that we're worthy of friendship, of romance, of relationships. All of these things are still tapping into that same fundamental human need that we need to show the world really how exceptional we are. And this creates a natural tension, right? Because we both want to stand out. We want to make sure that we're seen, but we also inherently want to belong to society. So there's always a little bit of a push-pull there. And this really played out in quarantine. So we absolutely want to belong. And part of belonging in this environment meant getting in line, right? Falling in line with what society was telling us to do. This little clip is actually from a New York Times article where all of these New York, if you know anybody in New York, you know that most people fled the city as soon as there was talk of lockdown. They went to, anywhere and everywhere that they could that wasn't New York City proper. And a lot of these influencers who have these huge followings, they documented the fact that they were leaving and they just got blown up by their followers. It was seen as a thing that was really distasteful. It felt like, you've got this huge following and you did the thing that they actually asked everybody not to do, which was take your virus-infested life out into the rest of the world. And it was really sort of jarring. We watched the influencer space pretty closely, and a lot of people really kind of fell out of the cultural limelight. So you've got to be in this way, really sort of falling in line and playing by society's rules. People were talking about staying home. It generated, over about 1.5 mentions. And we saw that celebrities and fashion brands were really sort of making this a thing, right? It was all about influence. So all of these global celebrities were really pushing people to do the things that were supposed to be done to make sort of life more livable for the rest of us. People, major fashion houses started releasing face masks that were cool. And all of it really started to take on a life of its own. So with regard to that, what do we think that people need to do? Well, first, you do have to prioritize prevention. You're going to have to make sure that people understand that you're doing things to keep them safe, that even when we talk about a post-COVID world, which right now we're maybe venturing into post-quarantine world, we've got a ways to go before we're fully in post-COVID. Some of these habits, some of these ideals about, maintaining some personal space and and cleanliness and hygiene and all of that is gonna still be out there. People are still going to expect that the restaurant they go to is gonna serve them in a way that is not gonna make them unsafe. And the push here is to make this prevention part of the experience. We have a couple of restaurant clients and several bourbon clients that rely on restaurants and bars to get their products out. And one of the things that we've really been watching is this space is how some of these prevention tactics are being incorporated into the environment without really hurting it. So one of the ways we've watched were these little glass greenhouses were basically set up outside of a restaurant to create ultimately a private dining experience, but certainly one that is incredibly mindful of social distancing requirements. The last two are pretty well connected, and so I'll go through them pretty quickly so we have time for questions. Human Era 2.0 is an evolution of human branding that we've been talking about for a little while. And all you need to know about human branding is that it's branding with personality, it's branding with purpose. It's really kind of looking at building relationships with consumers in a way that a human would build a relationship with somebody, by talking, by showing themselves, by having honest, sympathetic conversations. Purpose work came out of this, but it's not exclusively purpose-related work. Think about brands with a lot of personality, brands that show a lot of passion for what they do. Southwest is a great example of a human brand. You know, I think they have built their whole brand around being passionate about what they do and their mission. Burger King, human brand, ton of personality. We put Maker's Mark in that bucket. And then Tom's really has that purpose angle kind of locked down. But what we're seeing now is that there's sort of this next era of human branding, and it's all about this like incredibly raw and transparent experience. We know that sort of the message today is that we're all in this together. And tomorrow we think that you're going to see that it's about putting people first. Consumers want to connect with a human before they want to connect with like a faceless organization. And now that all of the humans behind the brands have really been exposed, people are going to want more of that. It's honestly all about bonding through a shared humanity, right? People have suddenly seen that brands are people too, or that at least there are people running the brands, and that those people are locked in the exact same human experience that they are. And they're willing to forgive more mistakes. They're willing to overlook imperfections when they're approached with transparency, when they're approached with honesty, with compassion. It's not the time right now for people to be overly polished. That feels insensitive. It feels out of touch with what's going on. And people are going to continue to embrace brands that ultimately have kept sort of a real approach to the situation. What does this look like from a corporate communication standpoint? It looks like people working from messy home offices and showing consumers that view. It looks like advertising coming from the home, advertising being shot in a way that's a little more raw because the slick production assets just aren't available right now. So this is kind of a new normal we're creating, and people are really kind of digging it. They like it. So it's something that we think will probably stay, this idea of, the face behind the brand. So what can you do? We talk about connecting through culture. Make sure that your company culture is really sort of out there, that people can get a sense of who you are on the inside, to start building those connections. And consider going off script. Encourage the people that are your brand to really sort of deliver that brand promise in an unscripted fashion. Allow them to be the representatives, to expose the brand's sort of human side through the real humans behind it. One angle of human branding is something that we have sort of leaned into more specifically on this. We're calling Compassion Inc. Brand movements, again, aren't new. We can talk about that as part of human branding. This visual is from the Dove Real Beauty campaign. I think it's one of the most well-documented brand movements in our recent history. But before now, they really weren't required, right? It was okay if you didn't have a brand movement. But what we've seen as consumers, cancel culture is a very real thing right now. And I would say selfishness has 100% been canceled. If you are a corporation that appears at all selfish to your consumers, you will be called out. They are making demands that companies make sacrifices for what they deem to be the greater good. They want corporations and brands to provide and protect, especially if they don't feel a strong sense that they're getting that fully from some of the institutions that are designed to do so. This change is really well documented. This is what people are talking about on social media when it comes to corporations. They're talking about how they are doing business, what they are doing, how they're helping their employees. So really think about the fact that this consumer is really going to start to demand that corporations do something and not just sit on the sidelines. And this creates obviously a ton of debates and challenges for different groups. Consumers want big gestures, if it's about protecting your workforce, if it's about providing local support. The example on the left is Scandinavian Airlines. When the airline business kind of took a major halt, they retrained their flight attendants to help in the hospital setting. So obviously got a huge amount of love. We're seen as doing the right thing, not just for their employees, but helping the community at large. At DoorDash, and I think maybe Uber Eats also did this. They started offering $0 delivery fees if you bought from locally owned restaurants, which was a huge way to not only get their service in front of people, to offer something up in a way that people might not have engaged before, but again, to support the community. So finding a right way. The one thing I'll caution on is just beware. If it's in any way shallow, people are going to call you out on that. McDonald's, I think they had the best of intentions, and I think they did a lot more than this, but they did not get a lot of praise for some of their messaging because it felt like it was just messaging. So be careful with that. What to do from a corporate level is just really think about how you can empathize and what action you can take. Think beyond profits. I think if you can see it as an investment in building consumer equity, it's a way to think about it a little bit differently, because it's not necessarily going to have a strong ROI on its face. And really understand that consumers see corporations as community leaders. They expect corporations to do something. And I think, one of the things that it would be foolish of me not to include in this section is that we are actually watching this very trend unfold in real time. These protests and demonstrations over racial equity issues have brands really in a conflicted state, right? Do I take a stand? What should that stand be? How do I show up? We're seeing a lot of big corporations, Nike and Ben & Jerry's got a ton of press over what they did, that they're really sort of saying, we are going to stand for this. We are going to make our statement, and we're going to make our statement big. That's not to say that this is the right choice for everybody, but it's something that we are really watching closely, how this unfolds, knowing that some of these trends have just started to sort of pop from the coronavirus pandemic, and now they're actually playing out in real time. If you are going to go this route, just a couple of things to be mindful of is make sure that you're doing it in a way that's meaningful to who you are and who you're reaching. I think, Nickelodeon, if you haven't seen what they did, they really said, this is our way to talk about this issue to our audience. And I think, whether you agree with it or not, the way they approached it was really online or in line with who they were as a brand. So I'm sure tons of discussions in the boardroom or probably over a Zoom meeting about how to do that and if to do it. And the way they decided to do it was really very fitting with who they were. And finally, if you are going to do something, you do need to be prepared, because people are ready to call anybody out. And you're going to have to prove that you're more than just talk. So that message is really getting a lot of critique if it feels shallow in any way. Great example here from a fellow agency. they, participated in the Blackout Tuesday, and somebody was quick to say, can you hire more Black people and people of color? The industry, the marketing industry as a whole has a very big diversity problem, and it's well documented. And their answer was ready and it was smart. And that's what I would encourage you to do. If you are going to take this approach, just be prepared to talk about the actions that you're taking, because saying we're with you is probably not going to be enough if you want to say anything at all. Definitely a tricky situation for a lot of corporations to think about. So those are the 7 trends. Again, we have a full report available on our blog. You can go to our website to find it. There are other COVID-related guidance pieces available on our website as well. But this report, again, a ton of work from a really smart team with a lot more information than I was able to share today. But I'll pause for questions now.
Thanks, Amy, so much for this discussion and your presentation. It's really interesting to take a look, not only what's happening, what's unfolding right in front of us, but also what our investors and businesses can look forward to from a planning perspective to target their consumers. And so I'm going to remind everyone to utilize the chat feature down below to submit questions for Amy. We do have some that were pre-submitted, Amy, that I'm going to go ahead and dive into while we encourage those on the line with us today to participate in the chat box. So Doe-Anderson developed these 7 trends, over the past, weeks and months. Have you already seen, even with the latest information, change and evolve as this pandemic turns into additional weeks and into months?
Yeah, I think, as we continue to track some of this stuff, some of it I mentioned, but we are definitely seeing some changes. I think that, 2 things are going to be really important depending on which market you're in. And here in Kentucky and in Louisville, I think that we were spared largely a very devastating health crisis. And we are already sort of getting back out into the world, albeit a little bit cautiously, which is definitely affecting how people can run their businesses. But for markets and people that are more dramatically affected, these trends are going to be even more pronounced. I think a couple that we're seeing really sort of explode as this goes on are, again, the accelerated digitization. Some of those statistics are really shocking in terms of the growth and the adoption of some of these tools. Their preparedness angle and looking at how businesses are embracing prevention needs, how they're really incorporating it into the environment or into the service in a way that doesn't feel sort of, I guess, jarring or offensive. The other thing that, again, we're watching unfold with the racial equity demonstrations is this idea of corporations really being engaged and finding out how they can help or that they need to ultimately take a stand for some reason or another.
And Amy, that kind of goes right into my next question for you. Obviously, there's a lot unfolding as we speak that's not exactly paired with COVID-19, although there are some elements with what's going on in our community. So over the last few weeks, we've noticed that the conversations are evolving. There's a different narrative out there, a different priority. So how do you see advertising and business adapting their business models to show either like solidarity or a responsiveness to the demands for social changes that are being asked from their audience, their consumers? So one question, for instance, is how can companies go about sharing an authentic message and not appearing opportunistic, and trying to convince companies that they may want to move in this direction, or maybe they haven't considered it, prior to all the things that are unfolding?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky tricky dance for a lot of corporations. I think that I would say that a couple of things. If you are going to engage, I think you should have a real strong point of view in terms of what your impact or role in any of this can be. I think about our many healthcare clients, and so many of them have come out to talk about very directly racial inequities in healthcare, and really making commitment and talking about the things that they're doing actively to try and fix that community health problem. That is an issue that they are actively addressing. And frankly, working with them for years and years, I know that that's not a new issue. They're not jumping on the bandwagon there, and they're able to share stuff they've already set in place and the efforts that are already being made. And that is a very, again, authentic way for them to say, this is how we are engaging in this issue. Obviously, not every business, not every service has a real sort of role to play there. And I think then it's just a matter of kind of thinking about, who is your audience? What do you owe to that audience? And if you're a business or a brand owner, kind of, be transparent. And I think, the fear is always, well, we're going to offend someone. But I think that if you look at, what Nike has done, for example, they weren't cavalier about it. They know exactly who is buying their products, and they know exactly what they needed to say to that group. And I don't want to say that that's some marketing ploy. I think that there's some sincerity there, but I think that they were very, intentional and informed about the choices that they were making all the way, 2 years ago when they initially ran their Colin Kaepernick spot. So I think that it's just about really thinking about who your audience is and what you actually provide in relationship to that audience or in relationship to the issues at hand.
We've received a couple of questions specific to COVID-19 and the global pandemic. Are you all sensing that there is some level or will be some COVID-19 messaging fatigue out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're actually watching that very closely. It's something that's come up already with some of our clients. And I think that the advice that we would give people is, yes, that those words, those messages very deliberately about, or very specifically about COVID-19 or coronavirus, that's going to start to fall on deaf ears. I think what you should take from this report is that there's an underlying need or a value or an expectation from consumers, and that's what you should be tapping into. It doesn't have to be on the nose. Because of COVID, we're doing this, but if you know that consumers are looking for an environment that feels more protective, then talk about, how you're being protective. Don't say we're being protective because of COVID. Or you don't even necessarily have to say, we know you want to feel protected. So I think you can tap into that underlying emotional need or expectation without going straight at the reason why.
Great, thank you for that. One question that's a bit sort of close and dear to GLI. You mentioned sort of the social good aspect of companies and this evolution towards not only putting it out there, but embedding it within the identity of companies and businesses. GLI, we've actually supported, and we worked on legislation in Kentucky that almost incentivizes businesses while they're pursuing a social good, like they can do so and make a profit. So what are some things that Kentucky businesses in particular, or Southern Indiana businesses can think about as they are maybe dipping their toes into more of that social good awareness, and how it can be not only part of their branding, but their business identity?
So I think when we talk about purpose-driven branding or brand activation or brand sort of action, I guess is another way to think about it. I think that, it is oftentimes something that's hard to wrap into sort of the full ideal of your marketing plan or your business model. But when you do, what you're building is ultimately long-term equity. So it is one of those things that, we often think about as the more interwoven it can be with the service you provide or the products you create or the audiences that or the consumers that you support, the more it will work to your benefit in the long term. So brand purpose, brand action is all about investing in long-term equity. It is not about short-term results. And that's something that I think is a really hard thing to kind of think about, because it does require investment, if not just from sort of a human resources and mental energy standpoint, often real financial investment. So I think, we always like to advise our clients that it shouldn't feel like a bolt-on thing. It shouldn't feel like this thing that sits on the side of what you do inherently as a business. Really sort of be intentional about finding some kind of brand action you can take that is inherently woven into the core of your brand identity. And that helps you just kind of find ways to make it more a holistic part of the business model. And then again, think about it as a very long-term investment. It's all about building loyalty and long-term equity with consumers, and not about a short-term relationship. You'll get some of that, but that shouldn't be the intention of it, because otherwise you'll drop it really quickly. You won't get those results right away in a big scale.
That's really important, Amy, and thank you for kind of mapping that out. We agree. It has to be sort of a genuine investment, and it's really helpful to use sort of the branding and marketing lens to reinforce that these things are not mutually exclusive, that we can encourage businesses to be authentic, pursue social good, and ultimately make a profit as well. So thank you. One question we received goes back to your comments about social media and some of these influencers. As people have been on social media, probably more so, right, during the pandemic, do you feel more companies will move towards using that platform, that form of advertising, versus, I guess, like more traditional sources? And can you comment on, from a social influencer perspective, sort of that expert piece versus just a testimonial piece for consumer behavior?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I know that, again, there is a really thoughtful and pretty succinct report that we've issued on sort of how the media landscape has changed because of the COVID situation. I mean, if you think about, take TV and streaming and put those side by side, you're reaching a whole lot more people than ever before with streaming services like Hulu or Netflix or Disney Plus. That has very limited advertising opportunities, frankly, especially when you look at some of those sort of more walled off systems like Disney Plus. So you have to kind of be a little bit savvy about how you bring that in. Social media specifically certainly has become a very viable marketing platform. I think that one of the things that we like to make sure that our clients know is that you have to really think about both sides of social media. There is the organic stuff, the stuff that you just post out there for free. And then there's the paid angle, which has a lot of different components and a lot of different delivery mechanisms. Organic social used to be a thing that sort of we could think about as free advertising. Those days are gone. All of the algorithms are designed to sort of force brands and companies to really use those paid tools. But it is a really viable platform, and you can get a lot of information even just through free online sources about what audience is where. The targeting is very, very nuanced, so you can get some pretty good targeting parameters in place if you're paying for some of those media opportunities. As far as influencers go, this is actually something that we've been watching for a little while now. we think that the shift is going to start to move away from some of these mega influencers who are just sort of giving you a, a mention, to more micro influencers who have something actually to do with whatever it is that you're offering. So if you are, if you're a spirits brand, there are people who are micro influencers in the space of cocktails at home. There are people who are micro influencers in the space of home entertaining or bourbon aficionados. They don't have the huge audiences, but their influence is much greater. And so you think again about, it's worth paying a little more per eyeball in those moments because you really want them to be the people talking about your brand or your service. The other thing that I'll say is that I do think eventually we'll be shifting back to some of the more traditional media forms. Out of home marketing has taken obviously a huge hit because people haven't been driving around. So there's stuff in, on an outdoor board on I-64, your eyeballs on that are just so much more limited. But as people start to sort of break free from their home isolation, those types of opportunities are going to reemerge. And I think that, it's not that TV is dead or that radio is dead or that outdoor advertising is dead. It's just sort of that it took a little bit of a hiatus as people were kind of, camping out in their homes. So I think that landscape will probably rebalance a bit. Now, I do think the streaming service versus the traditional linear TV is probably a change that will stick. The exception will be when live sports comes back on air, then I think you'll see probably a big shift back into linear TV as a viable sort of way to reach a lot of people with the most compelling type of message.
Thank you so much, Amy, and for everyone at Doe-Anderson for this opportunity and the partnership, and for providing this timely and informative presentation today. So thanks again. And thanks to all of you for joining us. As we mentioned at the top of this call, we are all in this together. And as the voice of your business community, GLI continues to support you during this critical time with the latest news on legislative issues and their impact on your business and resources that are available to help you, your employees, to get through this crisis. And so we're working really hard to plan for how our community will prepare for a time after COVID-19. For a summary of today's discussion or access to other resources, I invite you to check back and visit our website at greaterlouisville.com. You'll notice in the chat box, we've included a link to an event survey. Please fill that out. We really are looking forward to your feedback and to see how we can adapt and provide content and programming that provides value to you and your business. We'll also send a reminder email including that information later today. And again, we want to invite your feedback. A recording of today's meeting will also be included for your reference. So we hope you join us at our next webinar, which is tomorrow, Friday, June 5th. Can't believe it's June. June 5th from 10:30 to 11:30, when we will have a discussion with Cushman and Wakefield and iDNA about returning to work and what that may look like for office space and the businesses in those traditional workplaces. So with that, we say, please stay safe and well, have a good day.